Hi, we're going to talk about a process that you should go through every time you encounter a text. Every single one. It does not matter if it's a chapter in your textbook, if it's a research article, if it's a journal article that you're reading, newspaper, somebody's blog. If you go through this process every time you're reading a text, you will maximize the time that you have to read. So even if you have 15 minutes, you are going to get more out of that 15 minutes than if you just opened up and started to read at the beginning of that chapter or article. Because oftentimes we start on page 1, we read until we get bored, or we fall asleep, or we get distracted, and then that's it. We don't ever come back to it. So if you have a quiz, if you have an assessment on a homework. Let's say you had to read chapter 1 for your sociology class, and you opened up to page 1 and you read for 15 minutes and you got to page 8. If it's a 40-page chapter, there are 32 pages that you have absolutely no idea what was on those 32 pages. None. But if you do the SQRRR, that's what it's called, if you do this process, and you have the same 15 minutes, you are going to have an understanding of all of the important pieces of information in that chapter. So which would you rather? Would you rather only know 8 pages and bomb your test? Or would you rather know the concepts, all the big concepts for the entire 40 pages? I would like to know all 40 pages. So if you do SQ3R every time you read, you're going to get more out of your time. I promise. So in college, the reality is you're going to be assigned multiple chapters in multiple classes or multiple readings and text that can be quite challenging and the text can be complicated. This process, SQ3R, makes reading purposeful and meaningful so that you use your time effectively and efficiently. It is a 5-step process for working through the text, so that you, when you read, you comprehend it and you process that information at the same time. SQ3R stands for Survey, Question, Read, Recite, Review. Survey, Question, Read, Recite, Review. All right, so here are the benefits before we even talk about what that means. It activates your knowledge and it activates your thinking about a topic before you even begin reading. So it gets those neural pathways in your brain vibrating and making connections. It allows you to review information as you are learning it. You can create study guides and notes that will help you actually study and review the information. You will not have to reread long chapters. You might have to reread sections, but not long sections. You can figure out your test questions before you get your tests assigned to you. And it's not a quicker way, but it is likely to reduce the amount of time you will need to spend studying. Okay, because you will be spending your time actually understanding the chapter as you read it. So you won't have to go back and figure out what it all means. You will have it all figured out when you're done reading it, which these are awesome benefits, I think. Okay, so let's talk about what each step means. Survey. Survey is the first thing that you should do. Okay. When you survey, you are going to look at the title of the chapter. If there's an introduction, read it. Look at the headings, subheadings, look at the pictures. Look at boldface words. Do they have objectives listed? Some chapters, some authors will have the objectives listed at the beginning of the chapter. Other authors break them up and put them throughout the chapter. You need to know that. so that you know what you're reading and how to chunk that information. Sometimes there's study questions at the end. If there is a summary, you should read the summary. And if you just do the S, if that's all the time you have, look at all the information you've already armed yourself with. You've read the introduction and the summary, you know the headings and the subheadings, you've looked at the graphics, which are expensive for authors to purchase to put in their books, so the graphics are essential. You know the objectives of the course. You've already got a lot of information just by surveying. And when I taught in the public schools, I taught mainly ninth grade, but I was teaching 12th grade one year, and it was Brit Lit. And if you've ever read Beowulf, the language is so difficult. And so this was probably October, we were reading Beowulf, and the kids were just flatlining. They were not participating, not saying anything, not doing anything. And so I said, okay, extra credit, who can tell me what a heathen is? And it was crickets. And I'm like, are you kidding me? The word is defined in the center margin. So they had been at school using the textbook for over 2 months. And they didn't realize that the bolded words were defined in the margins. Wow. Okay. So each of your textbooks is going to be set up a little bit differently. The author will think for you a little bit differently. But once you know how the first chapter in that text is set up, every other chapter will be set up the exact same way. So if you just have a couple of minutes, survey it, get a general understanding of what you're going to be reading. From the survey, you create the questions. You can turn headings and subheadings into questions. If your teacher gave you a study guide, if there are objectives listed, turn those into questions. Because it gives you a purpose for reading. No longer are you just like, oh, I got to read pages 1 to 40. Now you're like, I have to figure out what the definition of thermonuclear dynamics is. And it gives you a purpose. And if you have a purpose, you're more likely to do it than not. From there, you're going to vary your plan of attack. Okay? If you're going to read a dense legal or scientific text, you probably are going to have to read slowly, and you're going to have to spend more time in it than if you're reading, Essence Magazine or an article on a blog published by Joe Schmo. You'll be able to read that a little bit quicker. So based on your surveying and your questions, then you're going to plan how are you going to read it. Are you going to be able to read it all in one setting? Are you going to have 2 settings? Are you going to give yourself 20 or 30 minutes at a time with 5-minute breaks? You're going to kind of plan your time out. So that's survey S, question Q. The first R is read. And you want to read actively. You don't want to be passive, because that's when you waste your time. You're like, oh, I just spent 3 minutes reading that page and I don't remember what I read. Well, that was 3 minutes wasted. You might as well not even have been reading. So when you read actively. You read for metacognition. That means thinking about your thinking and whether your information is clicking or whether it's clunking. So you're interrogating the text. You're asking the questions for the cue. What is thermonuclear dynamics? And you're reading, and then you're like, okay, I think the definition is here. That's where you struggle with your vocabulary. That's where you learn, we're going to learn some vocab techniques. And that's where you apply them as you're reading it the first time. So you chunk your material, read a section. If you turn a heading into a question, read to the end of that section and see if you can answer your question. Because reading actively is more than saccadic eye movement. Saccadic eye movement is literally your eyes moving from left to right. Okay? And our eyes move faster than our brain processes the information. So you have to make sure that you're slowing your eye movement so that you have time to process that information. Because when you read actively and chunk the material, it goes hand in hand with the second R, reciting. Reciting doesn't mean standing up and giving a speech. Reciting means putting that information into your long-term memory. Right then and there, it's starting that process of memorizing and internalizing the material. So you're going to stop, you're going to ask yourself the question, what is thermonuclear dynamics? And then you're going to answer it in your own words. And you're going to put that information down in your note format. This semester, we're going to learn 3 different note formats so that you are making your notes as you read, and they are effective, efficient notes that you can actually use. You can hand your notes to somebody else and they could learn the material. And if you're like, I don't know what thermonuclear dynamics is, but this next heading moves on to a different concept, I better go back and reread the section on thermonuclear dynamics so that I can answer my question. When you think you're comfortable with that, then you move to the next heading. It's a question, so you're reading to answer. If you can answer in your own words, you put it down in your note format. You can make flashcards for essential vocabulary when you're reciting. So you're kind of moving back and forth between reading and reciting for each section or chunk of text. And then what you're going to do, once you have chunked it and you've questioned and you've read and you've recited, the last R is reviewing. It's taking those notes, taking those questions and answers, and saying them to yourself over and over again, or having a study buddy and questioning and answering over and over again until that information is part of your long-term memory, so that you can use that information in whatever way you need to. A project, an essay, a test question, class discussion, outside in your career. When you review your notes, when you review your reciting, that's when it becomes part of those neural pathways. So that the next chapter, when you are surveying it, you have all this more background information to tap into. Okay? Sorry, this is a little weird formatting, but it's Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus said and proved that the longer you go without reviewing information, the less of it you recall. So let's say you have 100% information from chapter 1 right after you're done reading it. If you wait 1 day to review it, you only know about 55% of that information. If you go 7 days out, man, you only know about 15% of that information. But if you look at the chart on the right, it shows you how you can overcome that by how many times you review. So you want to overcome the curve by planning time immediately after class or after you've read something, 24 hours later, less than a week later, less than a month later, because look at how much you're going to recall. So by taking this additional time to use this method, the information you retain is used throughout your study time, and it moves it from the short-term to the long-term memory. And then once it's in that long-term memory, it is easily accessible in any situation. Okay. So I want you to practice SQ3R every time you read something. Survey, question, read, recite, question, read, recite, question, read, recite, question, read, recite the whole way through the text, and then use your notes to review. I promise you, the first time it might be awkward. The second time, less so. And if you do this every time you read, you are setting yourself up for such success.